The Galactic Confederation of Sovereign Species, or the GCSS as most beings called it, was many things. It was ancient, it was powerful, it was, in the honest opinion of senior xenobiologist Vraal Okhen, almost embarrassingly organized. Every species that had ever joined the Confederation, from the towering Dorazi of the sixth spiral arm to the microscopic pell-woven of Nebula Orin, had been studied, catalogued, and filed under the Unified Vulnerability Registry. It was, without question, the most comprehensive biological database in the known galaxy. 412 species, 412 weakness entries. If you were a Dorazi warrior, your weakness was high-frequency resonance waves, because your hollow bone structure turned your own skeleton into an instrument of destruction when the right pitch hit it. Not pleasant. Vraal had seen the classified simulations, and he still occasionally woke up from bad dreams about them. If you were a Luminara diplomat from the Vel cluster, your weakness was dense magnetic fields. Their entire nervous system, which was electric in nature, short-circuited like a cheap machine from the outer markets. Vraal had once accidentally caused a minor diplomatic incident when he forgot to turn off his scanning equipment during a Luminara luncheon. The ambassador had gone stiff as a board mid-sentence and toppled directly into the soup. The soup, notably, had survived the encounter far better than the ambassador's dignity. Every species, every file, every weakness, neatly annotated with severity ratings, exposure thresholds, and recommended field countermeasures. 412 species. And then there were the humans. Vraal leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest, and stared at the file on his screen. It glowed at him in the dim light of his research station aboard the GCS Omnirath, a vessel the size of a small moon that served as the Confederation's primary mobile research platform. The file was, objectively speaking, an insult. Species designation, Homo sapiens. Planet of origin, Sol III. Common name, human. Date of contact, 312 cycles ago. Threat classification, undetermined. Natural weakness, pending determination. 3 question marks sat at the end of that last line. Vraal had checked the record 3 times to confirm they were question marks and not some kind of clerical smudge. They were question marks. He had inherited this file from his predecessor, the legendary senior xenobiologist Praven Udo, who had dedicated 30 years of his career to the human weakness problem before retiring in what the official record described as voluntary early retirement due to personal enrichment needs, and what everyone in the department described as a complete nervous collapse. Praven Udo had been a brilliant scientist. He had successfully catalogued the weaknesses of 11 species during his career, including the notoriously difficult Morkai, who had 7 independently functioning nervous systems and whose weakness turned out to be a very specific shade of orange. Nobody had seen that coming. Praven Udo had looked at the human file for 30 years and found nothing. 3 question marks. Vraal pulled up the research notes. There were a lot of them. The first generation of researchers, led by a scientist named Dovik Sen, had approached the problem logically. Every known sapient species had some form of physiological weakness. The Confederation had never, in its entire 4,000-year history, encountered a species without one. The assumption was therefore reasonable. Humans had one, and they simply needed to find it. Dovik Sen's team had been thorough. They tested atmospheric vulnerabilities. Humans could function in a startling range of atmospheres, far outside what was considered biologically reasonable. They required oxygen, yes, but they had demonstrated a capacity to adapt to low-oxygen environments over time through a process their own scientists called acclimatization. They also had developed, within 3 generations of spaceflight, pressurized suits, recycling systems, and atmospheric processors that they carried with them everywhere, so even their primary atmospheric requirement was, in practice, irrelevant. Temperature sensitivity. The research team had been hopeful about this one. Humans were warm-blooded and had a narrow internal temperature range that, if violated, would result in cellular death. Exciting on paper. But humans had invented something called clothing within their first 100,000 years of existence, followed shortly by fire, then heated shelters, then portable heating units, then suits capable of operating in the vacuum of space. Their response to every environmental threat, Xen had written with increasing frustration, was to build something that neutralized it. Gravitational tolerance. Also promising, until researchers discovered that humans had been training their bodies to function in high-gravity environments before they even left their home planet, simply because they found it interesting. Xen's final report, written at the end of his tenure, contained a paragraph that Vraal had read 4 times this morning alone. The fundamental difficulty in cataloging the human weakness, Sen had written, is that the human species appears to treat physiological vulnerability not as a fixed state, but as a variable to be managed. Where other species possess a weakness, humans possess awareness of a weakness, and awareness, for this species, functions as a starting point rather than a conclusion. 3 question marks. Vraal closed the old reports and opened his own. He had a plan. It was a good plan, he was fairly certain, and it did not involve nervous collapses or involuntary early retirement. The plan was simple. Talk to them. The Omnirath had a human crew member. 1. Her name was Sable Arkin, and she was the ship's secondary navigation specialist, assigned as part of the Confederation's ongoing cultural exchange program. She had been aboard for 2 standard years. In that time, she had successfully navigated 3 asteroid fields, repaired a gravitational stabilizer using components from what she described as basically garbage, and won 17 consecutive rounds of Korath, the Confederation's most mathematically complex strategy game, against opponents who had been playing since before her planet invented the wheel. Vraal had been avoiding her, not because she was unpleasant. She was actually, by most accounts, extremely pleasant. She laughed a great deal, asked questions about everything, and had once spent 4 hours helping the ship's cook, a Dorazi named Bram Vulcan, figure out why his recipe for fermented pulp kept exploding. They had never figured it out. They had both seemed to enjoy the process regardless. No, Vraal had been avoiding her because the moment he approached Sable Arkin with his research questions, the situation would become real. Real in the way that meant results, and results in the way that meant either he cracked the problem or he became the 3rd xenobiologist to retire from it in professional humiliation. He stood up. He was done avoiding her. He found Sable Arkin in the ship's observation bay, which was a large domed room at the rear of the Omnirath where crew members could look at the stars when they needed to feel small for a while. She was sitting on the floor, which was unusual, eating something from a container and reading something on a handheld device, which was very usual. She looked up when he entered. Sable Arkin was, by human standards, what Vraal understood to be described as average in height. She had brown skin, dark hair pulled back from her face, and eyes the color of wet soil, which he understood was called brown and which humans found entirely unremarkable, but which Vraal found fascinating because no other species in the Confederation had eyes that specific shade. She was 29 years old in human reckoning, which made her, by human biological standards, somewhere in the middle range of physical peak condition. She was, by all the data available to him, a completely ordinary human being. "Vraal," she said and smiled at him. "You look like you've been building up to something." He had, in fact, been building up to it for 6 weeks. It was mildly alarming that she had noticed. "I have a professional inquiry," he said, "that relates to my research." "Sure." She set down her container. "Want to sit?" He sat, because standing over someone while conducting research interviews was considered rude in approximately 70% of known sapient cultures, including his own. "I am," he began, "working on the human vulnerability profile." She blinked. "I know. Everyone in the department knows. Praven Udo's old file, right? The one with the question marks." Vraal paused. "You know about the question marks. Bram told me. He thought it was funny." She smiled again. "I think it's funny too." He stared at her. "You find it amusing that the Confederation's most comprehensive biological database has been unable to determine your species' weakness for 300 years. "A little bit, yeah." She tilted her head. "Why? Does that bother you?" It did not bother him. It baffled him, which was entirely different. "I would like," he said, "to approach this differently than my predecessors. Previous research focused on physical vulnerabilities, environmental tolerances, physiological thresholds, and I believe they may have been asking the wrong question. He looked at her directly, because directness, he had learned, was something humans respected. I want to ask you what would stop you, not what could physically harm you, but what would, functionally, prevent you from continuing. Sable Arkin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's actually a much better question." "I thought so. It's also," she said, "a much harder one." She looked at the stars for a moment. The observation dome gave them a clean view of the Cathoran drift, a cluster of blue giants so far away they looked like sparks from a distant fire. "Can I ask you something first?" she said. "Yes. Why do you need to find a weakness? What's it actually for?" Vraal considered the question. It was, he realized, one that none of the previous research reports had ever actually addressed. "The Registry exists," he said slowly, "for strategic and medical purposes. Understanding a species' vulnerability allows for targeted medical treatment in emergencies, allows for safety precautions in shared environments, and, in historical conflicts, allowed for tactical planning." "So it's partly a weapons thing?" "It was, historically. It is now framed as a medical necessity." She nodded, slowly, and he could see something working behind her eyes that he did not have a word for in his own language. "Here's the thing," she said, "and I'm going to be straight with you because I think you're actually asking in good faith." She paused. "I don't think humans have one, a single one. I think we have a lot of them, and I think the reason the file is blank is because they kept looking for something clean and singular, like the luminary and the magnetic field. One thing, one result. And you believe the human vulnerability is not structured that way." "I believe," she said, "that the things that would genuinely stop a human being are the things your researchers would never think to test for, because they don't look like weaknesses." Vraal leaned forward. "Tell me," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the blue giants burned silently in their ancient light. "Okay," she said, "but I want you to understand something first. What I'm about to tell you is going to make the question marks make a lot more sense, but it's also going to make the file a lot more complicated." "I am prepared for complicated." She almost smiled. "I really hope so." She set her device down and folded her hands in her lap, and the look on her face was something he had not seen from her before. Thoughtful, careful, like someone choosing their words the way a navigator chooses a route, not for speed, but for what lies on either side of the path. "The first thing," she said, "is hope." Vraal opened his mouth, then closed it. "Hope," he repeated. "Hope," she confirmed. "Take it away from a human, genuinely and completely, and we stop. Not because we can't physically move, because we decide there's no point." She paused. "That's not a metaphor. That's a documented biological and psychological cascade that results in functional shutdown." Vraal stared at her. He thought about Dovik Sen's report, about acclimatization, about the humans who trained in high gravity because they found it interesting, about the crew member who fixed a gravitational stabilizer with garbage components and won 17 rounds of Korath. He thought about the fact that every single one of those things had something underneath it, something that he had not, until this exact moment, thought to measure. "You are saying," he said slowly, "that the limiting variable in human function is not physiological, it is motivational." "Partly," she said. "Partly." She held up one finger. "Hope is the first one." She held up a second. "The second one," she said, "is going to surprise you even more." And outside, the stars said nothing, because stars have the good sense to stay out of conversations that are about to get very interesting. Vraal was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. He knew it was 4 seconds because he was, by professional habit, always counting. His mind catalogued things automatically: distances, durations, atmospheric readings, the slight pressure change in a room when a door somewhere opened down a corridor. It was a researcher's reflex, the same way a soldier's reflex was to check exits. 4 seconds of quiet, and then he said, "Tell me the second one." Sable Arkin looked at him the way someone looks at a person who has just agreed to step off a ledge without fully understanding how far down the ground is. "Connection," she said. He waited. "To other people," she clarified. "Isolate a human, genuinely isolate them, not just physically but socially, Cut them off from every meaningful bond they have, and give them no prospect of forming new ones, and you will watch them deteriorate in ways that have nothing to do with food, water, or atmosphere. She paused. We have documented cases from our own history. Solitary confinement, castaways, people stranded in environments where survival was technically possible but connection was not. They died, Vraal said, some of them. Some of them survived physically but came out the other side with damage that never fully healed. She looked at her hands. We are not a solitary species. We can function alone, sometimes for extraordinary lengths of time. But functioning alone and thriving alone are two entirely different things, and the difference between them, over a long enough timeline, is measurable in every system of the body. Vraal wrote this down. He wrote it down very carefully, because it was the first genuinely new data point the human file had received in 40 years. Hope, he said. Connection. What is the third? She raised an eyebrow. Who said there was a third? You said the second would surprise me more than the first. The word more implies a comparative scale. You were comparing to something that came after. She stared at him. You're annoyingly sharp, she said, without any actual annoyance in her voice. I am a senior xenobiologist. Right, she exhaled. The third one is purpose. He wrote that down too. Not meaning, she said before he could ask. Purpose is specific. It is the sense that what you are doing matters, that your actions have weight, that the direction you are moving in is worth the motion. Strip that away from a human, and you get someone who is technically alive but pointed at nothing. She looked at the stars again. You want to neutralize a human, Vraal. Not kill them, not hurt them. Neutralize them. Take away those three things. Take away hope, connection, and purpose, and you will watch the most resilient biological organism in this galaxy fold like paper. Vraal sat with that for a moment. Then he said, but those are not physiological. No, those are not environmental. No, those are, he said carefully, psychological constructs that are unique to each individual and cannot be universally triggered by a single external stimulus. Now, she said, with something that was not quite a smile and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the neighborhood of both. You understand why the file has question marks. Vraal looked at his notes. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at his notes again, because sometimes data needed to be looked at twice before the shape of it settled properly into your understanding. Every previous research team, he said slowly, was looking for a frequency, a field, a chemical, a temperature, something external and universal that could be applied to any human and produce a predictable result. Yes, and the actual answer is that your species' limiting factors are internal, variable, and require sustained, individualized effort to exploit. That's one way to put it. That is, he said, a profoundly inconvenient answer. She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, unguarded and sudden, the kind that has not been prepared in advance, and it filled the observation bay and bounced off the dome and scattered into the dark the way light does when it hits water. Tell me about it, she said. We've been inconvenient since we figured out fire. Vraal looked at his screen. He looked at the 3 question marks at the bottom of the human file. He thought about 412 species, all with clean, measurable, documentable weaknesses. A frequency for this one, a field for that one, a very specific shade of orange for the Morkai. And then the humans, who had sat at the end of the list for 300 years with 3 question marks, and the collective exasperation of every xenobiologist who had ever tried to make them legible. I need to verify something, he said. Go ahead. You have told me the 3 primary limiting factors, but the fact that humans are aware of these limitations means they are also, presumably, working against them. She tilted her head. What do you mean? If hope is a vulnerability, then humans who understand that are presumably taking measures to sustain hope artificially in adverse conditions. She paused. Yeah, she said slowly. We are. If connection is a vulnerability, then humans in isolated environments are presumably developing protocols to simulate or substitute connection. Also, yes. And if purpose is a vulnerability, he said, then humans facing purposelessness are presumably constructing purpose from available materials, even in environments where no natural purpose exists. Sable Arkin looked at him for a long moment. "Vraal," she said, "you have just described every human survival training program ever developed." He nodded, because he had suspected as much, and suspicion confirmed was always a particular kind of quiet satisfaction. "So the question marks," he said, "are not because the weakness is absent. No, they are because the weakness is present but actively counteracted by the species' own awareness of it, to the degree that in most observable conditions, the weakness produces no measurable effect." "That," she said, "is the most precise way I have ever heard anyone describe why we are so difficult to deal with." Vraal looked at the stars. They were very far away, as stars tend to be. The blue giants of the Cathoran drift burned the way things burn when they have been burning for millions of years and have no intention of stopping. "I have a follow-up question," he said. "I figured you would. In the 300 years since the Confederation made contact with your species, humans have been involved in 4 minor territorial disputes, 2 trade conflicts, and 1 incident classified in the Registry as, and I am reading this directly, a miscommunication that escalated inappropriately." "The Pelin incident," she said immediately. "Yes, we don't talk about the Pelin incident. In none of those conflicts," he continued, "did any opposing party successfully achieve a decisive advantage against a human-involved force. In several cases, the human-involved force was significantly outnumbered, outgunned by measurable technological metrics, or operating in conditions that the Confederation's own models rated as functionally unsurvivable. And yet," she said, in a tone that suggested she already knew where this was going. "And yet," he agreed, "the consistent variable across all recorded incidents was that the human-involved forces maintained cohesion, maintained operational function, and maintained directional purpose past the point where every predictive model suggested they should have stopped." She nodded slowly. "Because the things that were supposed to stop us didn't. Because the things that were supposed to stop you were the wrong things," he said. "Every opposing force was attempting to exploit a physiological weakness that does not operate the way they expected it to. And meanwhile," she said, "we were keeping each other's hope alive, staying connected, and reminding ourselves what we were doing it for." The observation bay was quiet. Somewhere deep in the ship, a ventilation unit cycled, and the sound of it was a low, constant hum that Vraal had long since stopped hearing and now, suddenly, heard again. "I need to ask you something personal," he said. "Okay. Do you find this conversation unsettling? Discussing the mechanisms of your own species' vulnerabilities with a researcher whose professional purpose is to document them?" Sable Arkin considered this question with the genuine attention it deserved. "A little," she said finally. "Not because I think you'd use it badly, but because—" She stopped, started again. "Because the things I just described to you are not weaknesses in the way that the Luminara's magnetic sensitivity is a weakness. They're not flaws. They're the same systems that make us extraordinary, just running in reverse." Vraal looked at her. "Hope," she said, "in the right conditions makes us attempt things that are statistically impossible. Connection makes us sacrifice individually for collective survival in ways that produce emergent capabilities no single organism could generate. Purpose makes us push past every physical limit our bodies would otherwise impose." She looked at her hands again. "The same things that can break us," she said quietly, "are the things that make us nearly unbreakable. They're 2 sides of the same mechanism." Vraal stared at his notes for a very long time. Then he picked up his stylus and, at the bottom of the human file, below 300 years of accumulated research, below Dovik Sen's frustrated reports and Praven Udo's careful deteriorating observations, below all the atmospheric readings and temperature tolerances and gravitational stress tests, he wrote the following: "Primary limiting factors identified: absence of hope, absence of social connection, absence of perceived purpose. Note, all 3 factors are actively and systematically counteracted by species-level behavioral protocols. Note, the same neural and psychological architecture that produces vulnerability produces extraordinary adaptive capacity. Practical exploitability, negligible, classification recommendation, See addendum. He paused. Then, in the addendum field, he typed one line. This species is the question mark. Sable Arkin leaned over slightly, reading the screen at an angle. She read the last line twice. Something moved across her face, quiet and careful and very human. That's, she said, and stopped. Accurate? He offered. Yeah, she said. That's accurate. Vraal saved the file. The 3 question marks at the top of the document remained, because removing them now felt like it would be missing the point. They were not a notation of incompletion anymore. They were, he decided, the most honest summary of the data. He stood up. I will submit the updated report to the Registry board, he said. They will not like it. Because it doesn't give them a target. Because it does not give them a target, he confirmed. The Registry board has a strong preference for actionable vulnerability data. And what you're about to give them is the biological equivalent of good luck. They're complicated. Essentially, she smiled, and this smile was different from the earlier ones. Earlier ones had been easy, social, instinctive. This one was slower, more considered. Vraal, she said, yes, for what it's worth, I think you're the first researcher who actually asked the right questions. He thought about Dovik Sen and his frustrated reports. He thought about Praven Udo and his voluntary early retirement that everyone knew was not entirely voluntary. He thought about the xenobiologists before them, working methodically through every physical variable and finding nothing because they were looking in the visible spectrum for something that existed in a different frequency entirely. I had better data, he said. I had you. She looked momentarily surprised by that. Then she laughed again, softer this time. Well, she said, try not to retire before you file the report. I do not intend to retire, he said, with the certainty of a man who has just understood something that previously eluded him and finds the understanding sufficient reason to stay. He left the observation bay. Behind him, Sable Arkin sat with the stars and her container of food and the quiet fact that somewhere in the Confederation's most comprehensive biological database, her species had just received its first real entry. Not a frequency, not a field, not a very specific shade of orange. 3 vulnerabilities that were also, looked at from the other side, the same 3 reasons that no opposing force in recorded history had ever managed to keep a human down for long. The blue giants of the Cathoran Drift burned on, patient and enormous, the way ancient things burn when they have all the time in the galaxy and nowhere particular to be. 3 question marks remained at the top of the file, right where they belonged.